Well, to talk more about the fate of UNRWA, I'm joined in the studio by Hillel Neuer, Executive Director of United Nations Watch. Great to see you, Hillel. Thank you for being with us. So the panel, led by the French diplomat Catherine Colonna, presented its initial findings to the UN last night. What did you make of them, first of all?
Well, so far she hasn't published them. She summarized them by saying that they found the mechanisms of UNRWA to deal with neutrality violations are serious, but they need some improvement. Look, we know for a fact that UNRWA's method for dealing with support for terrorism is the opposite of serious, because for 9 years we've been sending them detailed reports about their teachers like Hillel Neuer in Lebanon, who praised terrorist attacks, and their response to us repeatedly was to attack us, to ignore the findings, refusing to meet. So it's anything but serious. Even the head of the panel, Madame Catherine Colonna, refused to meet with us. How can she conclude something about neutrality mechanisms when she hasn't spoken with the leading group that is exposing the very violations of neutrality by her group? And of course, she's someone who praised UNRWA just 2 months ago in a message to the head of UNRWA. So she's not independent, and this review is a whitewash, exactly as we predicted.
Well, when it comes to the UN, our own journalist, Mike Wagenheim, over in New York, he had a bit of trouble getting the UN spokesman to clarify the UN's own definition of terrorism. I mean, does the UN not consider the October 7th attacks to be acts of terrorism?
Well, they refuse to say it. Indeed, as you said, just the other day, the spokesman of the Secretary General said whether the acts of October 7th are terrorism is a matter of opinion. Well, really? The massacre and mutilation, rape and torture of women, children, infants, of thousands of people, that is a question whether it's terrorism. According to the UN, we see a complete moral failure.
You've been in Europe this week. You've been at the European Parliament. You're trying to present your findings. You say Catherine Colonna wouldn't meet with you. Have you had a similar reaction elsewhere in Europe?
Well, we were invited by the Foreign Affairs Committee of the European Parliament as a working group that's looking into UNRWA. We were invited to present. I was there 2 days ago. And there were members of Parliament who were interested, but the left-wing parties, 3 of them, the Greens, the Left Group, and the Socialists group, wrote a protest to try to cancel the meeting. They failed. Then they made a submission to remove all cameras from the meeting. So in the meeting, there were no cameras. It was an off-the-record meeting. And finally, several of them stood up and protested and said that I was an awful person, and they stormed out of the room. But having said that, the European Union, the Commission, sent one of their leading officials to present on UNRWA. Of course, he defended UNRWA. I got to speak. It was off the record, but I'm able to summarize what I said, and I exposed the fact that UNRWA is not doing life-saving work, that there are 450 UNRWA employees who belong to Hamas and Islamic Jihad. UNRWA has terror tunnels underneath their headquarters. They said they had no idea about it, but the Wall Street Journal reported that 10 years ago, UNRWA staff saw the parking lot was sinking in their compound, and it was sinking, of course, because there were terror tunnels, but they didn't know anything about it. So I exposed all of this very clearly to the European Parliament, and we're not going to give up the fight.
And the response is just to smear you, smear your work.
For some, for the UNRWA defenders it was. And, you know, UNRWA was invited. This is the European Parliament. They're giving hundreds of millions of euros, both the Commission and the member states, and UNRWA refused to appear. It means UNRWA cannot engage seriously on the facts. The fact of their support for terrorism is something they refuse to engage with. They have no answers. And their surrogates in the European Parliament cannot engage. They stood up, they attacked me, and they stormed out.
So what next then, Hillel? Might we see private lawsuits against members of UNRWA, against the group as a whole? Is there any kind of legal avenue?
There are several legal actions being taken. On our website, unwatch.org, we've summarized key legal actions. There's 2 lawsuits in America. One is against Secretary Blinken to stop funding UNRWA on a permanent basis, not just temporary. Second, there's a lawsuit against UNRWA USA. That's a nonprofit 501c3 that raises funds for UNRWA, even though they know that UNRWA uses the money for terrorism. And in France, there's a legal initiative. A submission has been made in the courts to pursue UNRWA for crimes against humanity. All of these legal actions are based in part on our work. We are continuing to encourage more legal actions. UNRWA is guilty of crimes, and they should be held to account both institutionally and individually.
And just in terms of the funding, I mean, as you rightly point out, European taxpayers have been funding UNRWA for decades to the tune of hundreds of millions of euros. You know, Europe is cash-strapped right now. There's the war in Ukraine, there's social security, there's all the rest of it. I mean, when you speak genuinely to European politicians, do you find that they are sensitive to that? Are they open to that?
There seems to be an agenda. And look, because there's a war in Gaza and there are serious humanitarian needs, that's being exploited. But the truth is that UNRWA is not an aid agency. There are many aid agencies in the world. UNRWA's main goal is to convince Palestinians in Gaza that they are refugees from Israel and that they have a, quote, right of return. And so there's a direct line from the UNRWA narrative to what happened on October 7th. And UNRWA and EU politicians, some of them get it. There were several who spoke up for me. I can't mention their names because it was off the record. But we know that at our event recently in Geneva, Asita Kanko was there, David Lega from Sweden was there. So there are a number of MEPs who do care. And there are others, sadly, who are just have a political agenda and they'll defend UNRWA and attack its critics no matter what.
And of course, as the investigation continues, as the lawsuits continue, some countries, among them Canada, Australia and Sweden, they say they will restore funding to UNRWA. Saudi Arabia just said they're going to give additional funds to UNRWA. Are you worried that it will just be back to business as usual in the end?
There is a risk, and there's a major battle going on. We see in the United States is trying to find replacement agencies to give it to the World Food Program to do the work instead. And Secretary General Guterres issued a directive to all UN agencies that they're prohibited from picking up, from standing up and taking any of the work that UNRWA used to do. So there's a real aggressive action by the UN to maintain a monopoly. They're more concerned about defending a failed agency, UNRWA, than actually allowing aid for Palestinians through any other group.
Okay, Hillel, thank you very much. Hillel Neuer.